Not so long ago, I was bound for the Eastern Caribbean from Lanzarote on a 60-foot sloop with a carbon aero rig. Mike, the owner, was a switched-on sailor whose mantra was to hope for the best while preparing for the worst. We were rattling along at over 200 miles a day in trades that were now blowing stoutly after a bit of a hiccup, and the yacht was only 700 miles from Martinique when we sailed through one of those afternoons that begin innocently but end up packed with interest. The first event was landing a couple of Dorados, fat enough to feed us for several days. This provided a useful boost to our morale, if not to that of the fish, whose luck was well out. We were celebrating the addition to our larder with afternoon tea and fresh bread, when someone noticed a rowing boat bobbing by less than a biscuit's toss on our starboard beam. It was one of those dreadnought pulling vessels with cuddies fore and aft, plastered with sponsors' stickers. Nothing unusual there, you might think. After all, the oceans are stiff with these contraptions nowadays. The only thing was, there was nobody in the well where the rowers go about their daily task of assisting wind and current to whisk them along. Fearing a Mary Celeste incident, we called them up on VHF. As each successive trade wind swelled past, she disappeared from view and was just vanishing on our wake completely when a scruffy-looking cove appeared in the aft hatch with a microphone in his paw. All was well, it seemed. It was a hot afternoon, so the skipper and his mate had decided to take a siesta out of the sun, then start pulling once more when the temperature dropped. We hadn't been far off running the poor chaps down, but when you're in the middle of nowhere it isn't realistic to post a lookout in the pulpit to spot any stray boats of minimal freeboard with no masts, so we rationalised our negligence and hoped to be forgiven. The third event of that busy afternoon came towards sundown. The unexpected activity had kept all hands in the cockpit waiting for the boss to declare happy hour when the boat suddenly rounded up and lay athwart the wind and sea with sails spilling as though they meant it. Adding an apparent wind factor of 9 or 10 knots had cranked up the breeze across the deck from a balmy 15 knots to the reality of a stiff force 6. When a well-found yacht sailing fast under autopilot rounds up in a hurry, one of four things has probably happened. It may be that she's broached, then lost all way so that the pilot can't bring her back into line. But the boat had been steering like an old shoe with minimum helm corrections. Nor had we been aware of any sudden sickening lurch, so this seemed unlikely. This left three less palatable possibilities. The autopilot had given up the ghost, the steering wires had let go, or the rudder had dropped off. It wasn't hard to deduce which. The first job was to declutch the pilot, then crank the wheel right over to encourage the yacht to bear away again. Steering hard to leeward, the wheel was suspiciously light, and even with the rig depowered, nothing much happened. This implied a steering issue rather than the autopilot option, which would have been very much the lesser of the evils. The pilot was connected by a robust ram directly to the steering quadrant, which meant that it wasn't the steering wires that had let go, or if it was, it didn't really matter anyway. With an autopilot like that, you have what is effectively an emergency tiller activated by the fluxgate compass and a computer. It might not be ideal for manoeuvring into an awkward marina berth, but it's great for passage making and getting you safely to an anchorage just outside the harbour wall. The problem was now looking horribly like some sort of rudder disaster. I was still hoping to find an alternative when my wife, who has sailed with me for almost 5 decades and understands my inherently upbeat attitude, made her first pronouncement on the issue. Unlike me, she subscribes to the view put about by an elderly Grand Bank schooner skipper of our early acquaintance, that the floor of the ocean is paved with the bones of optimists. Taking Mike and me to one side away from the children, she pointed out that she'd been advising us for some days about a clonking sound emanating from under her bunk, which was sighted right aft. We couldn't argue with this, and we learnt 2 lessons which I at least should have taken on board long ago. Never turn your back on an unusual noise, and don't even think about ignoring your wife. Somebody had to get out and get under to see what was really happening. Mike volunteered, but sensibly he didn't fancy being brained by the flat stern sections as they slapped down on an 8-foot sea. I contrived a lash-up that Nelson himself would have been proud of, and lowered him head first over the transom in a smart diving mask and natty shorts. When I winched him back up, he had only bad news. Our yacht was about to be minus her rudder. The boat had been built for shoal waters of Holland, as a one-off for a man understandably concerned about draught. It's not unusual for a powerful 60-footer to draw 9 or 10 feet, and this is a lot more than an honest Dutchman wants for his afternoon trip. The designer had therefore produced a marvel of variable draught. The yacht's floor was fairly flat, and keel, rudder and bow thruster could be raised and lowered by hydraulics. With it all retracted, she drew remarkably little, but in deep water, with rudder and keel fully down, she sailed well. The keel was daggerboard shaped with a heavy bulb on the bottom, but the rudder was more unusual. A short, faired stub had a much deeper hollow blade that slid down around it. This was what my wife had heard working loose. Mike was reporting it to be hanging off at right angles to its stub. There was no saving it, so he ditched the now useless appendage by cranking it up and down a few times to snap off the last bolt. This sent it on its way to a seabed so far below it must have taken hours to arrive, swooping down into increasing darkness in a series of silent parabolas. Whatever the fate of the rudder, it seemed as if the time had come to deploy the boss's emergency steering. Like all good seamen, Mike was ready for the event before it happened. We'd contrived a setup around a pair of poles to be secured and rigged strongly, one either side, poking outboard well abaft amidships. Each had a sheave in the end, with an in-haul-out-haul line passing through it back to the deck where it led to a winch. Drogues were attached to the bights of these lines so they could be hove in or out, thus increasing or decreasing their leverage. With the starboard one out and the port one in, the boat would swing to starboard, and so on. Unwieldy perhaps, but when used to balance the sailing rig it would generate a reasonably stable situation that would get us down to Martinique. While we were lugging this lot out on deck, I thought about that stub of rudder, and of the times I'd made long passages with neither autopilot nor wind vane. The answer to encouraging any yacht to steer herself, or something near it, is usually to reduce sail. Take the hit in terms of miles per day, and enjoy the lack of stress that follows. As a last shot, before accepting we were without steering, therefore, we reefed the main to a far smaller size than we'd had an hour earlier, while we'd been still barrelling along at 10 knots with a decent rudder to keep the lid on. With plenty of headsail set to balance her, we found she steered more or less under the rudder's mortal remains, so long as we kept below 6 knots. This represented less than the square root of her waterline length, that critical speed for easy helming and low fuel consumption. With the ship back under control, we stowed the poles, poured ourselves a late sundowner, and settled in for a relatively long haul. Numerous messages spin off from this minor event. One is that we all deserve a slice of luck now and then, and we certainly had ours that day. A second, more useful point is that those who would wander the high seas will do well to consider the benefits of an old-fashioned rudder, solidly attached at the bottom as well as the top.